Tonight's big story. He is one of America's most notorious serial killers, Ted Bundy. And he confessed to killing 2 women right here in Idaho.
That's right. Before Bundy was executed, an Idaho investigator sat down face to face with the murderer. And now, 25 years later, he opens up about what that killer told him.
Do you have a final statement you'd like to make before the sentence of the court is carried out?
Yes. Tell my family I love them.
It was the morning of January 24th, 1989, and the execution was set for the most hated criminal in America's history, Ted Bundy. The man, once known for his charm, had become the face of pure evil, a predator who stalked, tortured, and murdered dozens of young women. Now, after years of trials, escapes, and lies, every appeal was gone. The electric chair, Old Sparky, stood ready inside Florida State Prison. But outside those walls, the scene was unlike any execution before. Crowds of men and women gathered before dawn, waving signs, lighting fireworks, and chanting, "Burn Bundy, burn," as if celebrating a holiday. Bundy's crimes had filled America with fear, but his execution filled it with relief. The final 24 hours of his life had begun, a countdown not into silence, but into cheers and celebration for the death of a killer. As the sun began to rise over Stark, Florida, the world's attention turned to a small, heavily guarded prison where history was about to be made. Inside, strapped by law and time, sat Theodore Robert Bundy, Ted Bundy, a man whose very name had become shorthand for terror. To the public, he was not just a criminal. He was the monster next door, the charming face that masked unspeakable violence. Bundy had spent years hiding in plain sight, luring young women with fake casts, false authority, and a smile that concealed the darkest of intentions. When the truth finally broke open, the scale of his crimes stunned the nation. From Washington to Utah, from Colorado to Florida, Bundy left behind a trail of blood and grief. Investigators linked him to dozens of murders, though he himself would only confess to more than 30 in the final days. For years, mothers warned daughters not to travel alone, and communities lived in fear of the man whose brutality seemed endless. His trial in Florida for the murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach sealed his fate. Unlike his earlier court appearances where he had thrived on the spotlight, Bundy now faced evidence so damning even his charisma couldn't disguise it. The jury needed just a few hours to deliver the verdict. Guilty, sentenced to death in the electric chair. For a decade, Bundy fought against that sentence, with appeals, with delays, even with last-minute confessions designed to buy time. But every legal door eventually closed, and on this cold January morning in 1989, there was no escape left. The clock was ticking, the chair was waiting, and outside the prison gates, the people who once lived in fear were ready to see justice done. On the night of January 23, 1989, the countdown to Ted Bundy's execution entered its final hours. Inside Florida State Prison, the atmosphere was tense but steady. Guards reported that Bundy, once cocky and full of defiance, appeared pale, nervous, and restless. He prayed, he wept quietly, and at times seemed lost in thought, as if finally realizing there would be no more clever escapes, no more tricks left to play. Unlike many prisoners facing death, Bundy did not request a special last meal. The state prepared the traditional plate offered to those who decline: steak, eggs, hash browns, toast, milk, and juice. But Bundy barely touched it. In the end, his appetite had abandoned him. The man who had once fed on control and manipulation now had no taste for food, only for time slipping away. Throughout the night, he was visited by his attorney Jim Coleman and Reverend Fred Lawrence, who both remained by his side in those final hours. The guards allowed quiet moments of prayer and conversation. At one point, Bundy asked that his love be passed on to his family and friends, words that would later become his last official statement. In his final interview, given just hours before death to Dr. James Dobson, Bundy spoke of pornography's influence, warning that it had fueled his violent compulsions. It was a strange mixture of confession and deflection, a last attempt to explain the evil that had consumed his life. Outside the prison walls, while Bundy wrestled with his conscience, the crowds were already gathering. By midnight, hundreds of people filled the dark fields nearby, some banging pans, some chanting, many waiting for the moment they believed justice would finally arrive. Dawn broke cold and clear over Florida State Prison on January 24, 1989. It was the day Ted Bundy's fate would finally be sealed. Inside the prison, he rose early, escorted by guards who had watched him closely through the night. The nervous energy of the evening before had given way to a grim quiet. He was given the same simple breakfast again: eggs, toast, hash browns, and coffee. But, just as before, he barely touched it. Food meant nothing now. Every tick of the clock was heavier than the last. Bundy, the man who had once thrived on attention and played the system for years, now had only a few hours left. By mid-morning, the final preparations began. Prison staff went through each step with exact precision. Witness lists were confirmed. Journalists were escorted to their seats. State officials took their positions, and the execution chamber was prepared. The electric chair, Old Sparky, loomed inside, polished and waiting, the heavy leather straps ready to hold the man America had come to see as a monster. At 7 a.m., guards came for him. Bundy walked down the final hallway of his life, his shoulders slumped but steady, flanked on both sides by correctional officers. This was no escape attempt, no circus of cameras, just a condemned man on his last walk. Outside, the crowds had swelled to more than 1,000. Signs reading "Toast Ted" and "Burn Bundy, Burn" waved in the morning light. Fireworks cracked through the air. The atmosphere was surreal, half protest, half party, as if the entire nation had gathered to cheer the end of its most hated criminal. Inside, silence ruled. The witnesses took their seats. The room was still, and Ted Bundy, at last, was led into the chamber. The door to the execution chamber swung open, and Ted Bundy was escorted inside. The room was stark, brightly lit, and coldly clinical. In the center stood the electric chair, known to prisoners as Old Sparky, its thick leather straps and metal headpiece ready for use. Bundy's face was pale, his hair unkempt, but his walk remained steady. He was seated firmly in the chair, strapped at the wrists, arms, chest, and legs. Guards worked methodically, securing every buckle, ensuring there would be no movement once the current began to flow. Over 24 witnesses filled the viewing area. Journalists, victims' families, and state officials. On the other side of the walls, thousands more waited for word that justice had been carried out. As the black execution cap was lowered, the warden asked if he had any last words. Bundy's voice was quiet, almost flat, but clear enough for all to hear. "Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." It was short, emotionless, and unexpected. No elaborate apology, no confession shouted to the world. Just a final, almost ordinary farewell to his attorney and spiritual advisor. At 7:06 a.m., the switch was thrown. The first jolt of 2,000 volts surged through Bundy's body, his chest heaving violently against the restraints. A second wave followed, filling the chamber with the faint odor of burning flesh. His body stiffened, then slumped. At 7:16 a.m., Ted Bundy was pronounced dead. The man who once charmed, manipulated, and terrorized had met his end in silence, consumed by the very justice he had tried for years to escape. The moment the announcement came, Ted Bundy was dead, the reaction outside Florida State Prison was immediate. A roar erupted from the waiting crowd. Fireworks lit the morning sky, car horns blared, and people cheered as if celebrating the end of a long war. Some banged pots and pans, others waved homemade signs that read, "Toast Ted" and "Bundy Fried." The air filled with chants of "Burn, Bundy, burn." It was a spectacle rarely seen at an execution. For years, Bundy's name had been synonymous with terror, a reminder of daughters and sisters stolen in the night. Now, with his death, many felt a sense of release. The most hated criminal in America had finally been erased, and the nation watched as justice was carried out. But while the crowds cheered, inside the prison the tone remained grim. Officials moved quickly, removing Bundy's body from Old Sparky and taking it to the medical examiner. He was later cremated, and his ashes scattered in Washington's Cascade Mountains, near the very places where he had dumped so many of his victims. A haunting, fitting end to a man whose life was defined by violence. The execution of Ted Bundy marked more than just the death of one man. It was the closing of a dark chapter in American history. For investigators who had spent years chasing his crimes, for families who had endured decades of pain, and for a nation that had followed every twist of his story, January 24, 1989, was the day fear finally ended. Bundy's last words had been quiet, almost ordinary. But the cheers outside the prison told the real story. America was ready to see him gone. What do you think? Did Bundy's execution bring true justice? Or can there ever be closure for crimes so horrific? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story powerful, please like the video and subscribe for more true final hour stories from history's darkest cases.